Okay, good morning. So today we're going to continue our IO Psych, and we're going to talk a lot about illness, sort of what I started on Tuesday with illness and work. We're not going to really touch about service too much. That's going to be sort of the ends of the class, but I am going to talk about greed. And I'm prefacing this as Dethroning Greed because I'm going to present it in a different way than what greed is normally expressed as. And we're going to talk about defining our value system. We talked about on Tuesday the importance of working at a place where your values and that place's values overlap, and the importance of, for yourself and for your clients, to have a vision statement, a mission statement, and values in their own life. So later towards the end, I'm going to start breaking down my leadership theory, my chocolate chip leadership theory, and I'm going to explain the significance of 12 and why we see that repeated. And then next week, I'm going to go into sort of like more about my leadership diagram that I'll share with you today, and becoming sort of like a diamond, focusing on consciousness. And we'll talk about some of those things today. So the law that we're going to focus on today, and it's pretty much all month, is law of correspondence. Again, as above, so below, but mainly as within, so without. Really using the work experience. And again, this transcends work, but since this class is about work, really using that as within, so without, as a mirror, as the metaphor, to really become mindful, present, use work as a sacred space and an opportunity to see what needs to shift in yourself. I'll talk a little bit about Hercules. I'm just going to kind of revisit the Hippolyte myth. I'm going to talk more astrology in terms of archetypes, the Pisces and the Virgo. I'm going to share with you the 6th and 12th house that we talked about on Tuesday. And we're going to talk a lot about today the Neptune archetype. The Neptune archetype has to do with the innocent, has to do with more of a passive aggressive, manipulative, covert power style. And we're going to talk about both overt and covert power styles or power currencies. And we're going to tie this into greed. And then I'm going to tie in Saturn, which is really the archetype, or that Sentex archetype that we're studying all month, which is the sort of professional archetype, or the limitations archetype. So I know you guys are young, but you might be familiar with the movie Wall Street. So Michael Douglas played Gordon Gekko in this movie. And there's a very famous scene where he states greed is good. And it's sort of the premise of today's lecture, is the idea of greed. And I'm going to be dethroning greed as it's usually interpreted. So we can look at greed and the archetype of Saturn and limitations in a different light. And then Neptune in a different light as well. So the definition of greed, and there's many, I Googled many, but this one seemed to be the most that repeated: a selfish and excessive, and that's the word there that I really want to concentrate on, desire for more of something, such as money. I saw it with money, I saw it with food, I saw it with things, than is needed. And the premise of today is, when we talk about this Neptune archetype, or this ocean archetype, because Neptune rules the oceans, it's linked to the toxic water theory of the womb, of this shadow love language, of covert power, of passive aggressive, of codependence, of what parents do to children. It talks usually about money and food and acquisitions of things, but we never look at greed in terms of thoughts. And our thoughts are actually quite greedy, the accumulation of the thoughts. That's why I always say the first step that I work with clients is to get them to have these spiritual TED Talks. Thoughts, emotions, and desires all materialize when they're not processed into illness in the body, or externally in the law of correspondence as an argument or something with another person. And so what we are is very greedy in our thoughts, and we don't let go of our thoughts. And one of the antidotes, so to speak, is to have a very clear value system. And we're going to talk about that today. So this is just sort of an image of Hercules with Hippolyte. And you can see that he's sort of in a stance and he's got his sword and she's already handing him the girdle. And he's sort of in a defensive stance with his hand, with his legs, with his sword. And that's how we get. This is sort of a reiteration of what I said on Tuesday. We don't listen. We immediately go to that impure thought. You know, we go into our own defense mechanism, into our own child mode, our emotions, and we haven't even listened to the other person, much less understand that the other person might already be giving us what we want, but are viewed as a mirror to us. And if we actually listened, we could get some guidance from what someone is saying or showing us if we really maximized the law of correspondence. So communication is hindered as a result of staying in child, of not having a value system, of not dethroning our parents, all of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today. So Erich Fromm says, greed is a bottomless pit which exhausts the person in an endless effort to satisfy the need without ever reaching satisfaction. This is linked to my psychological homeostasis. And I've said before, if you were hungry, you might kill someone for a piece of bread and your hunger would be satiated for a few hours. But when your emotional needs are never met, as they are never met unless you meet them yourselves, you're constantly seeking this greed where your thoughts, your emotions, your desires, where can I get my needs met? Where can I get my needs met? Perpetuate 24/7. And you're constantly creating situations to get your needs met. And it's just really never reaches satisfaction. That's the importance of moving into teenager, taking a pause, taking a breath, and then making a conscious choice, hopefully in adult, to define the need and meet the need for yourself. So I like to talk about emotional greed. You have emotional greed or thought greed or desire greed, the TED Talk. Failure to define your values is greed. I spend so much time with people trying to get them to define their values. People not only don't even know their top two values, and it can't be family, but trying to get someone to define in measurable terms their value system, it is like one of the hardest jobs that I have with clients. Yet it proves to be probably the most successful technique I have in practice with people to get very clear on what they value, to see the dishonesty of their life and that they're basically living a lie, that they're not living on truth, and to give them actual action steps that they can take to dethrone their parents and change their life. But the resistance is incredible. Most people will say to me, I don't even know what that is. They have to Google value statements, or they'll shout out authenticity or honesty or integrity, and they don't even know how to define it, much less give measurable ways to observe it. And so this inability or lack of desire or lack of knowledge to define your value system is greed. It's emotional greed, thought greed, desire greed. Because the moment you actually define your value system, you can let go of so much of the stuff that causes illness or causes you to be frustrated or keeps you in child. It really is sort of the food, if you will, that will satisfy that emotional hunger that I speak about. Getting sick is greed, and I'm going to talk about that today. Staying in child is greed. It's want more, more, more. When you get sick, you're owning your narcissism of never controlling your thoughts, emotions, and desires. You're going to talk more about that today. You get sick to break down the body, which is what limits you. And there is a narcissistic tendency there. But I also say, well, maybe there's a greed tendency in terms of trying to seek your value system when you get sick as well. When you get sick, you get an opportunity to revisit your emotional greed and where you're wasting your energy and do it differently. So you get an opportunity to perhaps dethrone your parents, have some quiet time, to really question what your values are and how you want to spend post illness, let's say, your energy, your time, your resources. You may call it a blessing, and then you thank God for not answering your prayers of more and more and more, the corner office, the promotion, whatever it is. Again, it's that magical thinking of giving someone else the power rather than owning it. There's a dynamic of that in the illness dynamic that we just want to bring light to, because you will see this in practice. The illness is a way to limit your earthly greed, time, money, resources, and spend time on your spiritual life. So there is an opportunity, if you sort of use the illness correctly, so to speak, kind of like my grief model to despair, that if you do the value system, or if you do some, dethroning or limitation and boundaries and 48 to 52 correctly, so to speak, that then you can spend 50% on your material and then the other 50 on your spiritual. So you've heard me say feed and fly, and parents will castrate their children. And feeding and flying is simply the metaphor that when the chickie's trying to come out of the egg, if you help him, his beak doesn't develop, or the butterfly can't fly if you help him out of the cocoon because his wings won't develop. And that's what we do. Unknowingly, I presume most parents don't intend to harm their children, and it's sort of a perpetuation of castrating and helping or hurting our children feed and fly. But it's narcissistic. If we don't let our children take care of themselves, then they won't leave you. So sometimes we're like, oh no, that's not the good job for you. That job interferes with your life, or what are you going to use that money on? And we don't let them sort of make mistakes or stumble on their own. And we don't let them have responsibility. And at a psyche level, if that child was born to meet your needs and you let them go, then your needs will fail to be met. In the head, that kid is constantly meeting your needs, but they won't be there to meet your needs any longer. And this is part of what happens in that triple goddess symbolism that I've showed you, where parents stay in sort of the full moon or the mother mode, and again, male or female, rather than going into the crone and finding their own identity and empty nest and discovering that there's something beyond being mom or dad. And then they back up and have a traffic jam in the whole system. The other thing, and this actually happened to me the other day, I was having lunch with a young girl who's a friend of mine, and her mother notoriously pits her father against her. And she was like, oh, I have this problem, but I'm scared to talk to my dad. I said, your father is actually your ally. Your father's a good person and he can help you. But the parents, especially the parent with the wrong alliance, will pit the child against the other parent. So already 50% of yourself, the bad buckets, you kind of hate or dislike because this parent has sort of badmouthed the other parent. I'm not even talking in divorce. This particular friend of mine, her parents aren't even divorced, but the mother has sort of set up the system where the dad is the bad guy. And so if we have that set up in our psyche that all of us have because of the triad, then 50% of our resources are negated, and we won't go to that parent for many things, good and bad bucket items, but even for help sort of in the material world as this girl. So you encounter the other referring to the other parent that you don't have the wrong alliance with as at work. And it's the person oftentimes that you dislike because they have the power currency that the other parent that you kicked out, the unintegrated parent, that you kicked out of the system to have the alliance with the wrong parent or the wrong alliance. And that's what you're going to see over and over. And that's where we can really use the law of correspondence and the mirror. Parents will often tell their kids, you're my everything. I die for you. This is very greedy because it continues this perpetuation that the child's sole purpose is to meet the parent's needs. This is why work is so important. This is why work in the astrology wheel is right after individuation. You leave the family consciousness, the honeypot, you find sort of the identity or the self, Then you go into work to sort of purify sort of these aspects or threads that you haven't totally integrated into your psyche just yet. We also have a very strong identification with roles in our family, and that child, you, me, is given a role in the family. Next week, we're going to do the Enneagram and the cycle of the corporate establishment. Every business has a cycle, and it's rooted in the Enneagram that I shared with you in the family Dethroning Olympus lectures on the family. It's the same cycle that we go through as humans, as individuals, as corporate entities. And we try to fulfill the role in the organization like we did in our family. And the workspace is a place to sort of remove those veils that's our only role or our only identity. So we need to dethrone our parents. Our parents do not give us clearly defined values. They may say hard work is valued in this home, and they talk bad about laziness, and you have to constantly be producing or being athletic or getting awards or getting straight A's. But they're constantly in a paradox. They're constantly confusing you with what they say and what they actually do. And so you don't ever know what those clear values are. You might say you do, but again, when I have the activity with clients to define the values in measurable qualities, they really stumble. And this really has to do with the lack of clarity that our parents have provided for us around these values that they say that they believe in. Not defining your values is greedy. You're going to see in the Neptune archetype this idea of everything, the idea of passive aggressive, the idea of covert power currency, the idea of no limitations and no boundaries, and you could do anything. These sort of grandiose statements, it's greedy because it doesn't teach you a limitation. It doesn't teach you to have sort of rules to live by. So that's the essence of the greediness that I'm talking about today. The other level of greediness is if we don't process our thoughts, emotions, and desires, we never let go. When you set limits on someone and you give clear directive or clear established boundary, you make that person safe, you make yourself safe. And then you can process those impure thoughts. I told you the other day, your impure thoughts are not going away. They're going to show up all the time. In my case, it's a pride. There's a constant pride, a constant ego, a constant narcissistic thought that shows up. And I've got to process it quickly so I can be present for the conversation, for the client, for the colleague. And so it's letting that go. But if we don't have limits, if we don't have boundaries, if we don't have a value system, then we never let anything go. Then we wonder why we're sick or overweight or feel tired all the time. You're carrying around all this extra baggage. So I was with a friend of mine the other day at lunch, and she's telling me a story very typical of her family. And she's like, "What do you think?" And I said, "You already know what I think." I said, "We've had this conversation before. I cannot give you my mental energy. Like when you're ready to do work, call me and we'll set up a session. But I can't keep engaging in the same thought and the same energy because that's my energy, and my energy is limited, and it's a limited resource that I have to value." So when we set very clear boundaries and limits like that, we have very clear conversations with people, there's no energy that's wasted. You're not giving too much. The other person is given permission to show up for themselves. So these aren't very comfortable conversations at times, but they're really what makes everyone feel safe. But I've told you before, your parents didn't do this. You never felt safe or secure, first unmet need. So we don't have that habit. Even people like me that have over power currencies does not mean that they're using their energy wisely. They're still not processing thoughts, emotions, and desires. And so not setting limits, not having a clear value system, not having sort of directives or clear measurable qualities around a value really is just another form of greed or gluttony or attachment, or what in Hinduism is called moha. And so it's not about money necessarily. It's not about food. It's really the wanting to never detach to these thoughts that you have. And there's something about holding on to a story and repeating the story and staying in the story. It just sort of feeds that child's emotional hunger that you have. I had a client yesterday and she's like, oh, I know this girl at work has a problem. And I know that any day now she's going to come. And I'm like, that's not good. You're like wasting your energy. First of all, what you want to do is say, I told you so. So I told you so is just gluttony and greed. The other thing is invite yourself in and say, hey, I've noticed that you might have something to share with me. Do you want to have that conversation? That's a way to sort of set a boundary and say, are you willing to invite me in? And the person has a right to say yes or no. So you ask for what you want and the other person has a right to say no. Or put it through the triad. Put it through the first 3 questions of the model. Mother, father, what don't I like about it? And what need does it fulfill? You process it and that's it. It doesn't take up any more of your energy. But we don't do that. We sort of just fester and fester and fester on something someone said to us or, a story that we're involved in because we don't like clarity. We want to be greedy with our thoughts, emotions, and desires that lead us to illness. And I'll explain some, ideas about why illness might be useful. So this is St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's a paradox, and Jesus said this, right? Love thy neighbor as thyself. And I've shared with you before. Well, we can't love thy neighbor if we don't love ourselves. It's the erotic love, the second chakra love that's all based on unmet needs. When we finally in the third chakra learn to love ourselves, then we can have agape love in the fourth and love someone else and actually do something for another without necessarily meeting our needs. We're nowhere near that. But he says that it's impossible for a man to hate himself. Accidentally, it happens. They love themselves according to what they take themselves to be, while they hate that which they really are. And so it's kind of like a paradox again. And it's like we're narcissistic and we love ourselves and we know that we're divine, but yet we're limited in this body. And our body is linked to roles, the daughter, the friend, the sister, the colleague, the manager, the CEO, that it confuses us. So it's like, do we hate ourselves? Why do we self-betray? Do we love ourselves? We're all sort of in this conundrum. When you have that impure thought that you're better than the person you're talking to, or you're not listening, or you're smarter, or they're ugly, or whatever the judgment is, immediately you're putting yourself in a hierarchy. You're putting yourself as better, because that's ultimately what we think. We are better than everybody else. That is the impure thought. That's what's so funny about the parental relationship is they say, oh, take care of someone needs, but really it's just about ourselves. So we're told constantly this paradox, meet others' needs, but be true to yourself. Well, which one is it? And this is part of what the work as a sacred space and the spiritual journey provides, is to identify not with our roles, but rather with nothing other than our divine. And then again, understand that we're limited in that divinity with this body, and we can purify and take care of ourselves and indeed love ourselves despite being low-level consciousness. So one of the questions I pose is, do we get sick because we love ourselves? Since sickness is an opportunity to be grounded in the body, and sickness, and I'll share some stats about workplace illness in a moment, is it an opportunity to get grounded? Is it an opportunity to bring ourselves back to the body, to the vessel that houses our divine, so that we do feel safe with our fire and that we're not going to sort of burn everything in our wake? Does it help to limit ourselves because we know our divine? Does illness have a place in terms of helping us manage our divinity? Also, we have to stop identifying with the roles and parents in the way our parents gave us roles as the academic one or the beautiful one or the nerdy one, whatever role our was in the family, and identify our own value system. And oftentimes illness creates the opportunity for that. And of course, loving ourselves despite our low-level consciousness. So Jung said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. And this is something reiterated. Pain is necessary. We all have pain. Suffering is optional. That's the victim. That's this Neptune archetype. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And everybody knows my whole view on the new age and light workers and everything's a light and positive vibes. Obviously, it's in the darkness that we're going to truly bring that to the light, like the Hydra and all the things we talked about in forensics. So we must will the truth, stand in light, and seek our own true, real good and not something false. This is what Thomas Aquinas said. At work, work provides mirrors since it's our day-to-day. And illness actually might provide us a reason to search further for our true self. So do we seek illness to get closer to the truth, to accept our body more so that the divine can work through us in a balanced state? I told you last week, illness limits our parents' power. When we were little, maybe your mom gave you a cookie or a cracker or let you stay home from school. You turned the dynamic of the hierarchy in your favor because now you're sick. So it's the same thing. If our low consciousness, sort of no value system is constantly the impure thoughts, the thing working in the background, how do we turn that around? Maybe it's through illness that we actually learn to limit our earthly power so our divine sort of 48 to 52 can come through. And is this greedy? Is it greedy to get sick? Is it greedy to use resources? Is it greedy to have time off, so to speak, so that we can do this work? So I want to know, will we do anything to face our soul with permission, even illness? Because Jung says people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But maybe if we haven't given permission and societally we don't have that option, maybe we're actually so programmed, like Thomas Aquinas says, to seek our soul and find our truth, that we need permission, and the only sort of societal permission is illness. So let's talk about workplace illness. 1.6 million workers suffered work-related ill health between 2019 and 2020. 51%, so more than half of those workers, suffered from stress, depression, and anxiety. I've told you before, anxiety is a validation need. Depression is a grief aspect in the sense that I've lost something I haven't finished using yet. And stress is directly related to the fight or flight mechanism of staying in child and trying to get our needs met. So you can see right there, validation needs, child script in full force. 30% are musculoskeletal disorders. Musculoskeletal disorders have to do with structure. The structure of your life needs to collapse, needs to break down. You'll see in a moment, I'm going to link this to passive aggressive and sort of illnesses that are sort of hidden illnesses. Oftentimes musculoskeletal disorders are the byproduct of people that have no clear value system, that don't speak up clearly, that don't act with clarity as to what they want. And so their body collapses to either get permission to do a TED Talk, to process their thoughts, emotions, and desires, or because they need to break down, because they need to sort of get attention, because the life that they lead is on faults. And 19% are some other sorts of illnesses. So greed might be linked to illness in the sense that illness may manage greed. When you get sick and you have to stay home, whether it's a day or two from work, a week, or out, on FMLA for a couple months, you're actually greedy in the sense that you're allowing yourself to come back to self and perhaps find that divine, perhaps do that inner work that other than illness, you would have no other option but to do that. So maybe it's an attempt to reach the 48 to 52, but it's the only societal accepted way And we use illness to sort of manage greed. And later I'll explain greed as the Saturn archetype in a positive light. So one of the things that happens, especially as we identify ourselves as narcissistic, especially as we identify that the body gets in the way. We are so part of the cookie dough. We are so the divine. We are so sort of God, so to speak. The body gets in the way. It provides a nuisance, and that's very typical with Pisces. So I have the Neptune archetype there. You'll see that linked in a moment with the covert power currency. You need illness to bring you back to grounded, to reality, to here. And because the body limits you and Saturn is limiting, it's the one that actually helps you. So it's perhaps this greed of dissociation, this greed of being all powerful, this greed of the narcissism that actually illness serves as the only function, perhaps, to bring you back to yourself. I was talking to someone last night and they were saying, oh, this guy I work with is so flaky. I said, well, that's the ultimate level of greed. I'm so flaky. I need you to remind me of my appointments. I need you to remind me that we're having dinner. I need you to remind me of my deadlines. This is directly related to manipulation, passive aggressive, and the covert power currency we're going to see in Neptune archetype in a moment. So you want to be a child emotionally, hence your validation needs, your stress, your depression, your anxiety, but then you still want to be an adult and have the responsibility of the title, the role, the job, and of course the financial success associated with it. So of course we're going to break down, because here you are living a fraudulent life. Which one is it? So there's something called the sick role. This was described by Parsons back in 1951. And he says that there are some benefits, so to speak, to the sick role. You have exemption from normal responsibilities, and because you're sick, you're not blamed for the illness. And this is linked even to people with lifestyle diseases. So based on your obesity or sedentary lifestyle. So Parsons discusses the idea of a sick role, a term which he describes as the social aspects of falling ill and the privileges. We don't think of it in this term. It's a privilege, an obligation which accompany it. Parsons goes on to say that a sick individual takes the role of the sanctioned deviance, meaning that the sufferer is not a functional member of society during the time of their illness, and their deviance must be policed, which is the role of a doctor or medical professional. Again, there's a limitation, there's a conforming, there perhaps is an obedience. This is very common because of the relationship of the family dynamics. I have a client whose father was a police warden, whose mother was a nurse. And she was very, very sick last year, but not only with COVID, she had a colon resection. Colon is sort of the crap. Okay, so the crap of the body, the crap of your thoughts. And I need to resection that off because I can no longer tolerate the impurity of my thoughts at a psychological level. That's what that illness is linked to. So we were talking about her illness and she was on full TPN, which is total parental nutrition. That is going back to the womb. The womb is the only time where mom is feeding you. So I asked her, I said, how did your mom take care of you when you were sick? She goes, I don't think she did. She would say, suck it up, buttercup. Basically, there was no attention. So in order to sort of recreate or to get some attention from mom in a very obviously unhealthy, passive aggressive way, she gets sick, ends up with TPN, total parental nutrition. They feed you from an IV, AKA the womb, when your needs are supposedly met, at least in food, in theory. And so she goes back to the childhood through this sick role. So you have permission to go back to the toxic waters. You have permission to be sort of, in her case, her father being a warden, it fits perfectly, sort of policed by the illness, and assumption, obviously, that doctors and nurses or whoever your healthcare team is going to take care of you, and an assumption that you're going to listen. As many people, obviously, like I did, didn't necessarily follow doctors' orders. Parsons then outlines 2 rights and 2 obligations given to the sick. The rights include exemption from a normal social role, like work, and lack of responsibility for their condition. Because you're sick, you don't have to take responsibility, because obviously you didn't create it. But what I take people to is, it's always, as many spiritual philosophies will speak of, it starts at the mind, all is mind, the principle of mentalism, the ether element that creates us, down to the earth element, when we look at philosophies and how the worlds were created. So we can't obviously bypass the mental aspect, but the physical is visible. The physical is tangible. Somebody actually has cancer, or they have, a specific problem. Well, then it's not your fault. But mental health, obviously, and we know spiritual health definitely doesn't get that same sort of right. The obligations include the act of trying to get well. You have to try to get well. Well, what if the sick role is serving you and you're not doing, quote unquote, as told, or what your family, your friends, your colleagues, your workers, think you should be doing? Also include the act of trying to get well and seeking competent help and cooperation with a medical professional. Again, and I'm not going to get into the whole, alternative medicine and the pharmaceutical industry and all of that, but this is sort of the obligation, is that you're trying to get better. He also sees the sick role as possessing 3 versions: conditional, unconditionally legitimate, and illegitimate role. Remember, I told you the other day that there's illegitimate authority and legitimate authority, which is linked to the parent that you have the wrong alliance with, or the covert or overt power currency style. So we'll talk about that a bit. In 1962, Mechanic defined something called illness behavior. And he says that this is how a sick person acts. There are a range of behaviors that are highly individualistic and variable. In my theory, and what I see, is that this is directly linked to how your parents took care of you when you were sick. What were you allowed to do? How did the hierarchy shift? How were you sort of off the hook when you were sick? And in my client's case that I just shared, she didn't have anything. So she had to go into a sort of really intense illness, severe sort of forced surgery on her, because she didn't have a template, so to speak, as to how mom took care of her. One of the questions I asked her was, what was your mom's favorite group of people to care for? And she said, senior citizens. And senior citizens, a lot of them have TPN. They're on that TPN before death, as they're sick. And so she identified in her psyche, perhaps mom likes older people. Let me get, sick in my colon, TPN, something that older people, that her mom used to manage the TPN and stuff with the dietitians and stuff at the hospital. And she made that connection. So we cannot minimize how the child lived out illness and how they were taken care of in terms of the illness behavior. That's why it's so individualistic. And I love that question when I see the correlation with clients. He says there's 4 elements to illness behavior: symptom perception, symptom interpretation, symptom expression, and coping behaviors. We've all seen this. Someone who has no diagnosis, but they feel sick, or someone who never knew about their diagnosis, and the minute they get diagnosis, all of a sudden they have a behavior of, oh my God, I'm so sick because I have fill in the blank behavior, even though it may not have any symptomology. The other thing that we see is how they use coping skills. So are they all happy all the time and they're pretending that illness is nothing? When I first got diagnosed with cancer, I was like, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. This is a spiritual illness, which I still believe it was indeed, but I couldn't neglect the body, which was sort of my MO and what I always chose to do, so to speak, was to neglect the body. The process of perceiving and assigning meaning to symptoms, this is big, especially in my field. Oh, the symptoms mean something. It's teaching me a lesson. And I absolutely work that way, so I don't defy that at all, but there are other things. Become intertwined with values and beliefs. And again, if you don't know clear values, you may not know exactly why you chose that particular illness. Pain itself may become the focus of the self and the self-identity and may be viewed as tangential to personhood. Believe it or not, pain is a role. It plays a role in defining your identity. I am attached to my illness. Every sentence that I speak, it's like, oh, but I'm diabetic, or I am this, or I have depression. So you're going to see this identification with that illness as a role that someone wears, almost like a proud sort of, a vest that they wear. In Christian tradition and in other spiritual traditions, pain and suffering, this is not uncommon in the island, belief systems too, that you're like given pain and suffering because of more moral, sin or moral problems. But also, and I said to you before, the sixth house, illness, all about purification, as if this pain and suffering is a way to purify your character or your soul. So people can create illness, not only for a greed to sort of push people away and have opportunity to work on their spirit, but they link it to their actual spiritual belief system. So Hans Selye created this three-stage model called General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, to explain the stress. So first there's like an alarm, that sort of thing that shocks you. Then you sort of hold that level of resistance, and then your body kind of gets exhausted. We're in a constant fight or flight or stress cycle because of our emotional greed. So we say it's because, now we're in traffic all day and we have deadlines, but no, it's actually linked to our psychology, to these unmet needs as children, and the emotional sort of need we have to constantly be seeking our needs. So using this model and this concept of gas, I tell clients, it's kind of like a fart in the system. You have to have a psychological orgasm. You have to sort of punish yourself, give a sacrifice to parents or an offering to parents, or create some sort of nonsense or drama when you have a stress problem. So it builds. Oftentimes it's the 100. Oftentimes it's linked to perfection. I'm so perfect. I ate so well. I did so well. I did my homework, whatever your sort of 0 to 100 swings are. And you need to release the system of the gas. So using sort of this play on the gas aspect and the stress, and physical orgasm, like sexual, during orgasm, the heart beats faster, blood pressure rises, breath comes quicker and heavier. Same thing when we're in the fight or flight response. These are the same exact criteria. And it's no different, the psychological orgasm, as it is the physical orgasm. And it's like a release in the system of, oh, I can't be perfect anymore. I can't hold this level of the 0 to 100. I need to sort of break down. Repeat of that, not only does that cause physical illness, as we see, caused by stress, but also psychological and spiritual issues. So illness, I said, is a way to purify greed. If you don't process your thoughts, emotions, and your desires, I told you, it's just like this. This is an energy bubble. This is a thought bubble, and it's tangible. I can touch this marker. You may not be able to have a tangible thought, emotion, and desire, but energetically, it's a ball of energy. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It goes directly to what that thought is related to. It goes to that organ. So for instance, pride. Pride is a heart issue. So it might take you to heart issues that you may have long-term as you get older, when that continues to be the thought that you don't process. If it's, let's say, gluttony or secrecy, it could be in the hips or the organs, the sexual organs. So when we did health psychology, I told you that ask the question, what is the function of the organ? If you can ask the function of the organ in which the person is sick, then you can understand. I had a client yesterday telling me about her best friend who has Parkinson's. So that's a central nervous system. The central nervous system has to do with validation needs, chaos, always moving, go, go, go. I am validated when I move. I am validated when I'm moving forward. and her friends was saying that she's tired of carrying all the weight of the family. But she's chosen that, and now the central nervous system validation of sort of the chaos in the family has now broken down her system. So you can ask yourself, what is the function of that organ? And that can lead you to understand what the impure thought that they haven't processed is linked to. So thoughts are materialized in the body. If you never let go of your thoughts, your emotions, and your desires, you get sick. It's greedy. It is greedy. So illness may be a way to break down something. It may not be that you look at your thoughts, emotions, and desires. You may sort of lose, if you will, the opportunity, but something's got to break because there's only 100% in the system. So hospitals are full of narcissists. It's notorious, right, that doctors are God and they have narcissistic tendencies, but it's much more overt. I ran a nursing school for several years, and I love nursing, but nurses are notorious to be passive aggressive. The Neptune archetype, which we're going to talk about in a moment, rules nursing, whereas the Sun or the Leo archetype rules doctors. It's more of the narcissistic sort of overt tendency, the sun in the sky. But the Neptune power currency is more covert. And then patients can be either or, depending on what need fulfills the illness and being in the hospital. Do they need the policing? Do they need the structure? Do they need someone to be more overt? Is it more covert? They kind of utilize the environment of the hospital. And don't think that covert power currency isn't as narcissistic as the overt. It's that idea of prince or pauper, playing it small or fearful, when maybe a narcissist is sort of full-blown in his or her power, seemingly. So the Neptune archetype. Neptune is the planet of the innocence, the archetype chart that I have in the classroom. It is notorious passive-aggressive. It's a covert power currency. It rules the oceans. Think of the landscape of the world. It's all oceans. The land is what stops those oceans, but it is water. It cannot be contained unless it is sort of earthbound. It's unlimited. It believes there's no unlimited resource in the earthly world, but the oceans is probably what comes most close to it. They have no boundaries. It's linked to toxic water theory, trying to get back into the womb. They have no limits. It's an attempt to not be obedient or conform. And a very common thing you'll hear clients with this strong archetype say is, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And I will be like, yes, you do know. Yes, you do know. Yes, you do know. And I can spend 5-10 minutes with a client confirming that they know and sort of bringing them in to sort of the landlock, to become more overt, because what they're trying to do is manipulate. This archetype is very, very passive aggressive, notorious with some helping professions, ours as well. Counselors, why are we so narcissist counselors? And I've said to you, we help nobody. The client helps themselves. Don't work harder than your client. Don't give your time, money, and resources. Model appropriate behavior for your client. That's in part for you, because we don't have these skills. It took me, the hardest thing I had to learn when I was in grad school was how to end a session. The tendency of the narcissist, the covert narcissist, as we are in our field, is let me give more. And again, it's not altruistic. It's to get your need met. That's why your time, starting on time as much as ending on time, is a good modeled behavior, first and foremost for your own psyche and your own Neptune passive aggressive, manipulative, covert archetype, but also to show your client to get empowered. So this is the Pisces Virgo axis. Again, that's 612 that I was talking to you. Pisces is considered the most spiritual sign. So what does it do? First of all, it rules the oceans, the bottom of the ocean notoriously, and we don't know what's at the bottom of the ocean, but we assume there's a lot of dead bodies and there's treasure. So look at the psychology of a covert narcissist, like the nurse, like the therapist, okay? Every single person has Neptune in their chart and has Pisces on a cusp. So you can go and see where you in particular are a covert narcissist. If you're a Pisces like me, this is sort of something that you have to work on, because our entire archetype is the scapegoat. It's the Jesus, the fisher of men, the age of Pisces. This is what did us so wrong, that now the age of Aquarius is trying to sort of rectify, that we serve one another by modeling the correct behavior. No one heals anybody. Therefore, we're all, sort of servants to everybody. So this is the most covert narcissistic sign. One of the things you'll read if you're into astrology is that Leos and Pisces make a horrible combination, because Leos are like the most overtly narcissistic, where Pisces are the most covertly narcissistic. And again, the relationship between Neptune in your chart and the sun being Leo, despite the sign, and Neptune being Pisces, will tell you a lot about the person's sort of covert narcissistic style. So Pisces in the sort of archetype, the Neptune archetype of being sort of the oceans and no boundaries, nothing can contain us. Well, we don't want a body, so we self-destruct. The body gets in the way of our spiritual work. That's why in the media, you see a lot of people very woo-woo, sort of, like floating in the heavens in their language and their dress. And it's not that it's wrong. It's unfortunate that that's how it's perceived, but it's linked to the truth of this, is that we feel we're beyond the body, above the body. We dissociate from the body. Whereas Virgo, as I told you Tuesday, is discernment, is knowing we need to sort things, that there are useful information in the earthly realm, mainly the other. And so here, and the sixth house says service and health, and obviously work and day-to-day, all the things I've taught you. But here it says self-undoing. Yes, at midpoint, we spend most of our life working, and that is to learn all the stuff that I'm teaching you all month. Eventually, when we go to the 10th and become our vocation, and then in the 11th, the servant to sort of humanity, if you will, the volunteer, because that's the volunteer house, then eventually we have to detach from all dogma, and eventually, obviously, we detach from our body when we die. And the wheel is symbolic of our entire life cycle. And work is where we spend a big component of our day and our life. So that is exactly what is there to teach us how to discern. And what we encounter at work is the opposite power currency. If you're covert, then you might not like the overt personalities. If you're overt, you might really dislike the covert personalities. And you're there to try to learn the other one so that you can be at the midpoint and bend and conform and be the one that you need to be when it has to be done. There's not one way to do it all the time. So that's the discernment. But Pisces is lack of clarity. It's all the oceans. There's no limits. Our Neptune, our Pisces archetype, our covert narcissism, and again, it doesn't matter what sign you are. Somewhere you have a covert narcissistic language that you learned in the womb. That's why it's linked to toxic water theory. That shadow love language of how you manipulate to get your needs met. At the lowest vibration of Pisces, that the low vibration animal is a piranha. Think of that, a piranha. Your covert narcissism, your covert manipulative, passive aggressive style is piranha. There's no grace in that. There's no spirituality in that. And so this idea of sort of presenting something to somebody so that they can do what you want them to do, it's like you're the puppeteer. And there are times for that, but we have to become aware of when we're doing that and when it's not healthy for ourselves and ultimately the other person. So again, workplace illness is greed, perhaps to limit this archetype, this covert narcissism, although illness is in itself a covert narcissistic tendency to sort of destroy the body because you're beyond it, because you're so divine, you don't need an earthly limit. But also, it's not processing, causing you to not process any thoughts, emotions, and desires that can break down the body. And again, wanting it all. Childhood, script, and adult responsibilities or adult finances. Eventually, it's going to break down. You can't have it all. So that thing of your parents saying, you're all, you're my everything, very manipulative and very destructive. You have to let go of things. That's the whole purpose of life, is learning how to die, which has to do with that Saturn archetype we'll talk about momentarily. So I've said to you before that I have a theory that pain is pleasure or pleasure is pain. Pleasure as pain is people that are very like overtly, maybe they drink a lot or party a lot. Eventually it leads them to pain and suffering because they might get sick, or they can't, there's slurred speech, or they can't go to work the next day, and it hits them financially. Whereas pain as pleasure is more of the water signs, the covert narcissism, where you use pain, but really it's that pain that makes you have a psychological orgasm. That is sort of the thing that gets you off and makes you feel so great. That's a very Piscean trait, so it's linked to that Neptune archetype. So Jesus was a good example of that. There's excess that too. That doesn't mean that there's less than. This is pauper as prince. So when you act like you're less than, or you're so humble, that you're not, you're still a prince in your psyche. Let's say you're still king, you're still divine, but you're acting as less than, or fearful, or cowardice, and you're acting as a pauper. You're actually a puppeteer. You're the one managing the strings, because people then feel bad for you, or the sick role or the illness role, and you're manipulating circumstances and opportunities. And it's a very covert power currency. King Herod in the Bible was the one that killed all the firstborn because he wanted to kill Jesus. He didn't want to be dethroned. This is also linked to excess. This is more overt power currency. I want to be in top. I'm the best. I have pride. I have hubris. And this is the prince as pauper. So you're prince, but obviously you're poor in the sense that your power currency is not going to get you fully to what you want. So I mentioned already some functions of illness. I don't need a body. I'm above the body. The Pisces Virgo archetype is learning to live as the divine of Pisces, that idea of being one with God in the body with discernment and limitation. Pisces is union with God, the savior archetype. So the body is obviously an impediment. Virgo per se as a sign, and I said this to you on Tuesday, is sort of the common folk sign. It's the materia prima. There's nothing real exciting. It's day to day. It's boring. It's I have to eat every day. I have to work every day. And there's no excitement there. It's not Leo sort of bright star, your will. And it's not Libra that's like fashion and parties and laughter. It's just kind of boring. But it's smack in the middle of individualism and getting to your 48 to 52, because Libra is the sign of balance. So in order for you to get individuated in Leo and become the 48 to 52 that we're going to talk about, you need that purification, that day-to-day routine, that discernment, that work as a sacred space provides you. But Virgo per se, and we all have Virgo and Chiron somewhere, is boring, mundane, commonplace. It's work, it's illness, it's day-to-day, it's discernment. It's no excitement. There's no fun in this sign. It's kind of just a common folk or a commonplace sign. And so we find it very boring. And you hear this with kids, I'm bored. You're not bored. You just don't want to go deeper to really get to perhaps an emotion that you're feeling, and you don't want to perhaps process and let go to realize that there is perhaps a narcissistic thought that you think that you're beyond. And this is what last week I was telling you, that guy who wrote that book, Gods of Aquarius, and now we're inventing categories of people because just being human just isn't enough. Now we have to be reptiles and special and aliens and whatnot. If you don't want to process any thought, emotion, or desire, because it leads you to your bad bucket and you'll have realization of who you are, your body will eventually collapse because it can't carry the weight of your thoughts. In spiritual adulting, I told you that you get a precursor, so to speak, around 33, which was Jesus's age, 33 to 35. Very common that people get some sort of illness, and oftentimes they're out from work, and it sets a foundation for deeper spiritual work later on. So burnout is a very, very common thing now, especially post-COVID, like high rates of burnout. I've been invited to consult on several sort of social justice, not-for-profit type platforms or organizations. And burnout has a lot to do with trying to live in the higher chakras, in the high consciousness. I serve humanity. Again, 11 and 12, Aquarius is the world servant. That's what we're headed to become, but we are not there. We're still meeting our own needs. It's still about ourselves. So burnout has a lot to do with being checked out. We're going to talk about in a moment, Thomas. It's a mental state of mind. And just sort of dissociated. We're so burnt out because we're not in the body. We're living only in those higher chakras. We don't want to process emotion. And I've told you before, emotion needs to be processed through the body to feel a feeling. So emotion turns to feeling and you feel it. So when clients tell me, Francis, I was in bed for 12 hours after our session, or I vomited, I'm like, that's great. You just felt your feeling. You took it from emotion, which is unprocessed greed. You let go of it, obviously materialized through the body. That's part of the function of the body. You've let it go. You've now felt the feeling. Burnout is directly linked to not doing that process, not using the body for real purification to feel the feelings. Because if you're only living in the higher chakras, you're still about the heart. I care, I'm altruistic, I'm serving, and it's not true. So I was talking to a client yesterday, and her entire musculoskeletal system, and I told you earlier, the structure broke down. She had injuries, her wrist, her neck broke, everything structurally is absolutely a mess. And she always talks to me about how she doesn't like to be up front. She likes to be behind the scenes. And I laugh with her because her birthday is January 2nd, and everything is a symbol, everything's a message. You're not born on the first day of the year, you're born on the second. You obviously like more of a covert behind the scenes, you know, sort of way to live, and she does. And I said, you know that you scream louder, and I'm obviously very loud. I go, you scream louder than me. And she goes, oh no, I yell loud. I'm like, no, I'm not talking about your actual voice. I'm talking about your illness. People scream very loud with the illnesses that they create. It's a form of manipulation of a power currency, of covert power currency, to yell and scream silently. And I don't know if you've ever heard of those people that like they scream till they lose their voice, or they scream that nothing comes out. That's like a power manipulative power currency, or a covert power currency. So I was telling her, I'm like, your entire destruction of your musculoskeletal, of your structure, kind of like the client I told you who is replacing both hips and refuses to acknowledge that she's her parents. These are illnesses that scream. They're a hidden type of illnesses that break down the structure of the body, that you want to pretend to not be seen, or very covert. Versus, for instance, my cancer, that's excess cells, growth is an overt, more of an overt power currency. I want to be seen, I want to take up more space. So they're both narcissistic, but the psychology of the illness, one is greedier, so to speak, because you're doing more, or you're breaking down and screaming louder in a covert way. So there's a greed to that element of illness. Workaholics are greedy. You want more, and you want more validation. I told you Tuesday that is not an admirable trait. And I talk often about when you're in one area sort of hyper-focused, that means you're taking something from someone else. The other day, someone said to me, oh, my colleague is so lazy. And I said, well, you're lazy because you neglect your children. And he's like, yeah, you're right. So if you're criticizing the laziness in another person, it's because you have it in yourself. And so if you're at work all the time and all you do is think about work, and you clock out and you stay 2 more hours, or you neglect your family or your responsibilities at home, then you're lazy too. You're just trying to neglect an area in your life that you perhaps don't feel comfortable with, or don't have as much clarity, you don't have the boundaries, the limitations in the 48 to 52. So you use sort of the workplace environment that's sort of very structured for all of us. We know there's a paycheck. We know there's a need that's met. We know there's a validation. We know there's a role, where maybe at home, those things aren't as clear. So we have to do that work with ourselves and our clients. So what disease do we all have? We all have the disease, what I say, omnipotence or not important. If we can't be divine, if we can't be narcissistic, if we can't be God, whether it's overt or covert, doesn't matter, then the 0 to 100 is I'm not important at all. So omnipotent beings cannot make contradictions true. This is in philosophy. There's this whole sort of conversation around Descartes. You know, can God or this divine omnipotent being make a stone that he himself can't carry himself? And these are sort of those philosophical contradictions and questions that we ask. And there's a branch of philosophy that's called volunteerism, which is that the will supersedes the intellect. The will is the soul. The will is the divine spark. That always supersedes the intellect, because I've shared with you before, it's past the intellect. The intellect is still an unmet need or a God of the earthly realm. To connect with the universal womb or the universal waters, not the toxic waters, its will, individuation is the sort of diamond. Work is a place that we can really sort of hone that skill, that we can really sort of identify the conundrum and work to purify day in and day out that we're spirit and matter, that we're human and divine. But ultimately, that's sort of the disease, AKA when you get sick or the sick role, is because you're struggling. Are you omnipotent or are you not important? And the 48 to 52 is the answer. So I was talking to someone the other day and I was like, the most important real estate is in my head. So my energy, my time, my resources. So I work with this team on a project, and one of the girls in the team was not meeting her deadlines. And it was really taking up a lot of time in my head. And I was like, oh, this is not okay. When someone takes up your thought space, the real estate in your head, they own you. That's it. And so you're giving all of that sort of energy to that thought. It's often our parents, and that's why every person, place, thing, or situation is your mother or your father. And so I called her and I said, what do you need? And she's like, oh, I just need some time to adjust my schedule because it's summer and the kids are home. I said, okay. The moment I'm clear and can honor her, that's it. I let go of the thought. But if I don't say anything and I don't have a clear directive or ask clearly, what do you need or what can I do? Sort of in my leadership style, it just eats at me. And then that thought space is occupied by people, places, and things and situations that I don't want in my head. Your most expensive real estate is your head, is your mind. Your mind technically isn't in your head, but we oftentimes say that. So if a thought is taking up a lot of space, think of trash, think of like a ball of trash, and it goes to that organ. And repeatedly, you're going to develop, even if it's a broken toenail, even if you stump your toe, even if you get a migraine, that is an indicator that there was a thought that was sent to that part of the body to tell you something. When thoughts linger, either clearly ask to enter the space. If someone is bothering like that happened to me, I asked her, I'm like, can I enter the space and provide a suggestion or ask a question? And she said yes, because it was a work environment. But I did the same thing in personal relationships as well. And I asked to invite myself in because if I can sort of provide some clarity around the situation or set a boundary, and it solves sort of my thought problem. The person says, no, that's fine. Then I just put it through the first 3 questions. Is it mother, father? What don't I like about it? What need does it fulfill? The moment I have my spiritual TED Talk, it goes away. It no longer takes up the space in my head. I mentioned before, I told you so, and holding on to wait and see that what you said happens is just greed. And it's narcissism, and it takes up space, and you want to confirm that you're omnipotent. So this picture here is of 2 monks, and this is a pretty famous Zen story. So there's, you see this sort of puddle, and one monk carries the woman across the lake or the puddle. They're not allowed, they're ascetics, they take an ascetic vow, they cannot touch a woman. So the man, the one monk, carries the woman across. About 20 minutes after they crossed the lake, the other monk that didn't touch her said, well, you carried that woman and you're not allowed. And he said, yeah, I let her go 20 minutes ago and you're still carrying on to her. So it's not about the physical act. And I've already said to you, the moment you have the thought, it already materializes. It already enters the body. It already enters your community. It already enters the world. So the monk who never touched the woman carried the woman way longer and further than the monk that actually touched her and let her go. So the minute you set boundaries, you're clear, you have values, you have limitations, you process the thought, emotion, desire, you let it go. You're not in this greed process of hoarding thoughts, emotions, and desires that are linked to childhood, linked to your buckets that you don't want to let go of. So your value system, this is the most important probably aspect of the work I do with my clients. And it is a lot of difficulty for most people. By not defining your values, you will not dethrone your parents. And we don't want to dethrone our parents, especially after they're dead. By not defining values, you can stay blind to the lie you live. This card is the obelisk or the tower in tarot. And what it represents is all falseness needs to be broken, needs to collapse, needs to shatter. It's a very intense card. And you see this symbol down here, this is called the ayin. It's a Hebrew letter, and it means eyes. In order to see the truth, the spiritual striptease, you need to see the truth of yourself. You can no longer steal the fire from the gluttony, the greed, the envy, the jealousy from your third chakra. When you start seeing the truth of yourself and removing the veils, you have to set values. You have to live in truth. You have to have a philosophy of life. And so the number one thing of greed is not defining values. That's why it's the Neptune archetype. No clarity, everything's just go with the flow and all is divine and all is spirit and it's all positive. That's nonsense. That is just not wanting to have any definition, any boundaries, any limits, and pretending that you're omnipotent and divine when you're in a limited body. So when I ask clients, so you can apply this to your own life and with clients, is what are your top two values? And it cannot be family. It has to be definable and measurable terms. So yesterday I had a client and she says honesty. And she's going and she can't define it. And she was giving me a story that she used with someone at work, and she's the manager. And she's like, you know, Frances, when I give, one of my employees a message, I say, I'm going to give you a loving suggestion. And I said, covert power, narcissism, total manipulation. They'll never know how to succeed. They don't know if you're backstabbing, if you set them up for failure. They have no clue. And so she decided that her first measurable directive for honesty would be to give a clear directive to do something. Go throw that in the garbage can. Clarity, you know exactly if the person is being honest because they told you honestly what they exactly want from you. And people have so much trouble. The more you do this and the more clear you get, the more you can dethrone your parents and you can hold yourself and others accountable. This is adult, and this is not self-betrayal. This is self-love. So you know you're God. Now what? So Morgan Freeman played God in Bruce Almighty, and he says, I am God. So it's easy to play him. They say God is in all things. So if God is in me, then I am in God. Therefore, I am God. God does not exist without me. And we've already established that there's a divine spark or cookie, piece of the cookie dough in the world expressed through you and only you. And that makes you divine, even though you have low level consciousness and limited. So a lot of people that I talk to that create illness because they don't know how to keep their God or their divine or their narcissism in check is one of the reasons that they create the illness, is to sort of help the container, so to speak. And a big one of all of the deadliest sins, of all of the Greek values, that was like the biggest no-no, hubris or pride is the biggest of all. It's like all the other sins or all of the vices come from there. So if in our narcissism is directly linked to pride. How do you, knowing that you're divine, sort of check that? So I have this problem, and I have plans on where I'm headed professionally. So my father, to me, is an extremely humble man. As such a hustler and a go-getter and an admirable person, he's actually quite humble. And I asked him, I said, how did you stay humble? And he's like, my mom's the most humble person ever. And at that moment, it dawned on me, I have the antidote. My dad's, his good bucket is the antidote to my bad bucket item of pride and hubris. And so this is where we go to our good bucket items. This is where we see that we already have built in us. We don't need to get sick. We just need to use the antidote, the tools in our good buckets, not as a way to live in the 0 to 100 and pretend we are not the bad bucket items, but it's the integration of both. Because when we understand that that parent that we have unintegrated also has good bucket items, then we can start to find that midpoint. So we start integrating the other power currency, we start integrating the good bucket qualities. This is obviously where judgments play a role because they're linked to our values and we know what we value and we can start owning and integrating. And of course, the constant spiritual TED Talk will help us stay sort of humble. So no matter what your sort of fear is, as a result of identifying you're divine and you think you're better than other, there's an element of pride there and hubris. And somewhere in your good buckets, there's a version, and in my particular way, I use the word humility. And like I said, my dad, and as he said, his mother was humble. So I have that sort of armor in my buckets, but go to your good buckets as the antidote. So instead of sickness, you can use good bucket items to balance that. So Google used to have people interview like with these crazy feats. They'd give you like crazy things. They'd have you stand on your head while doing a math equation, some weird stuff. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's stuff that I read. And then they recently decided they wanted to change their interview process. And they decided that they want somebody that is humble and argues. And I was like, this is what I sometimes say, that it's the gracious bully. So I'm not a bully in the sense that I bully you, but of course, shattering snow globes, there is a sort of bullying to that. That's the sort of, no, we're going to look at the truth. But then of course, there's the gracious part, which is you hold the space for your client. So they said that successful, bright people rarely experience failure. And so they don't learn how to learn from the failure. They instead commit the fundamental attribution error, which is if something good happens, it's there because they're a genius. And if something bad happens, it's someone else's fault. And this is what we cannot, that's greedy. It's never me, it's always the other person. So that's a very covert, obviously, power currency manipulation. So what did Google do? They decided that they wanted people that argue. They argue for their point of view. That's your value system. That you know what your values are so clearly that you're willing in a meeting or on a project to argue and fight for your value system. And in the same light, you're humble enough to know when you don't know something or when you're wrong. And Friedman says you need a big ego and a small ego in the same person at the same time. This is the 48 to 52. This is Saturn. This is the limitation. This is work as a sacred space. This is using the body, discernment, the work environment to monitor your narcissism and your ego maniac tendencies, and yet be humble enough to know when you're wrong or to listen to the other person. And this is indeed a real leader. So one thing that comes up a lot about jobs with clients is, oh, you think you chose your job consciously? Because we think that we actually choose our job. I know very well that I cooked, cleaned, and counseled for my mother, and therefore I became a therapist. It's very clear, and I see this correlation all the time. We think that our job is a conscious choice, but it's actually not. We're trying either to heal something from those unmet needs, or that first 0 to 7 shame, blame incident that I told you about the other day that I ask clients, and they build their career, their empire on that. So usually it's linked to a job that resembles what your parents did or the complete opposite. So this client that I had yesterday, her mother was a nurse, home health and senior citizens. And what she did was she went into like home health care, but the business side of it. So again, it's not the exact profession, but what she tried to do was fix the situation, which was the business part, the currency, the limits, the boundaries that nurses don't tend to have. So it's oftentimes linked to the buckets and the wrong alliance parent, not only your power currency, but the job that you choose. Neptune jobs I mentioned are nursing, therapist, or omnipotence jobs where I can help or heal as if you're responsible for another. So this is a very key thing on your intake when you ask what a person does for a living, what they're attracted to in terms of their job. It can also be the unintegrated parent. They can do the job of the unintegrated parent. I have a client who's a graphic designer, and her father's like a graphic engineer, but he does like the graphic part of it, and she does not like her father. Mom pitted dad against her, and she tried integrating him through the profession. So it's not uncommon. So let's talk a little bit about the Saturn archetype. The Saturn archetype is the antithesis or the limitation of the Neptune archetype. If Neptune is the oceans, and Neptune is everything, and Neptune is no clarity and no limits and no boundaries, the Saturn archetype is the one that we need. Saturn, I told you, is Chronos, it's time. It's the one that deals with work and profession. 30, 40 years that he ruled, we are working to fine tune. He's the one that teaches us to conform, to bend, to be supple, to be flexible. We need some time with the 7-year cycles of the skinny cows of Saturn so that we can grow into who we need to be. He's oftentimes resembling Scrooge. Why? Because Scrooge was greedy and depressed and angry and bitter. And I told you, if you do not use your work environment to become flexible and supple and sort of move with the rhythm of the seasons and the changes in your work experience and your work life, you're going to bend and break. I mean, you're going to break if you don't bend, and you're dry and bitter. But Scrooge is actually the archetype that we want in terms of greed. We want Saturn because he is clear. There are limits, there are rules, there's authority, there's a structure. This is exactly what we need. We need to be greedy using this archetype to support ourselves. High vibration Saturn is not greed, it's actually limitations in order the 48 to 52. I don't like the word selfish for self, but I highlighted it here. I always tell you there's self and there's selfish. There's no such thing as selflessness. Selfish is if you take someone's power or they take yours. Self is when you own your power and you don't take anybody else's. So he's the right way to teach us self. Having limits is not being greedy. Saying no is not being greedy. Me not giving you the real estate in my head is not being greedy. It is self-love. It is authenticity. So when you start defining your values, you can become authentic. This is the template for your behavior. Then you can show up as the authority, as the king, as the ruler that Saturn in a highest vibration represents. I told you earlier that the low vibration of Neptune is the Piranha or Pisces. The highest vibration of Saturn or Capricorn is a unicorn. It is practically impossible to find. Someone who lives their values, knows their values, sets their limits, owns their power. This is how rare it is. So here's the Saturn as the planet. It has rings around it. Rings limit you. It gives you boundaries. Your values are defined. It's a 48 to 52. I've also told you that in your sixth chakra, your chakra has two petals. Here they are, the sun and the moon. Your parents gave you a value system upon conception. You do not change from that value system. But what you do is, in a passive aggressive, covert power currency, is you manipulate saying you're one thing when really you're honoring their system because you don't ever want to question and dethrone them. Again, greedy, wanting it all. Your mom and dad will always serve as counsel. The petals are right here at your ear level, at your eye level. There are going to be limitations. Every person, place, thing, or situation is mother or father for a reason. Because in this life, in this vibration, in this consciousness, you came to have them as a template. But you use that template to then define clearly your own values. That's how you dethrone mom and dad. You give them their rightful place, but you're on the throne. The other thing that this glyph of the sixth chakra demonstrates is that there's a triangle downwards. I told you that burnout, people are living in the highest chakras. Well, the highest chakra, sixth and seventh chakras, which are all the elements and the sort of divine, this is God as form, has the triangle downward, which means form, which means earth and water element, which means the negative polarity, which means this earthly realm. So in your goddess form, in your sixth chakra, in your kingdom, you need the gods to have given you a template. And those gods are mom and dad. You cannot defy them. It's about dethroning and using what they taught you so that template doesn't harm you, but rather helps you. So you've got Neptune as a covert power currency. You've got Mars, which is more of that zealot or that aggressive or anger, sort of overt power currency. And it's the adaptability of having both, not being angry and burn out or stressed all the time, because Mars rules that sort of stress, fight or flight. And it's not about pretending that there's nothing wrong or being manipulative and covert all the time. Your preferred wrong alliance taught you one power currency. You need to adapt and learn the other one as well, and when to use which. That's the 48 to 52. Saturn, again, like we talked about last week, is conformity. Conforming is just to the social sort of needs. It's not about obedience and authority, forcing you to do something, but rather your peers and saying, oh, this is the right way to show up in this situation. This is more appropriate in this situation. This is also linked to the seasons, the law of rhythm or the principle of rhythm, where everything has a season. Meaning at every situation and every month and every year and every time of your life, there's a time to be overtly aggressive. Perhaps if, God forbid, your child is getting harmed or something. And there are other times to lay back and let others have the front row. So this has to do with understanding the principle of rhythm in the metaphysical realm. And the Horae are the goddesses in Greek mythology that are known as Dike, Eunomia, and Irene. These three represent Horae. Horae is the Greek word for time or seasons. Everything has a season. That's a song, and it comes from the Bible. Dike is justice. Justice is served. In a moment, we're going to talk about Vedanta, which is like release the outcome. The universe will take care of that. You are not God. You do not have access to the outcome of every situation, and you trying to control it is very material and greedy. Eunomia is order. We need order. The seasons have an order. We know that every spring is followed by summer. Like we see this. This is something trustworthy, secure that we can count on. And Irene is wealth and peace. So it's not greedy to be adaptable. It's not greedy to have both power currencies. It's not greedy to set limits and boundaries. It's actually going to give you peace and wealth, both spiritual and material. So I have a saying that leaders need mirrors. The person that you hate at work is most like you, and you don't want to see it. If you define your values clearly, you will start seeing it. The 12 archetypes I'll talk about momentarily are mirrored at work. There's a Mercury, there's a Neptune, there's a Saturn, there's a Mars, there's a Moon. All of these archetypes that I shared with you the other day are all in your psyche and reflected. The ones you don't like are the ones you need to work through because it's something in yourself that needs sort of adaptability. It takes a team to produce you, just like the ants from the myth of Cupid and Psyche. You're up against the clock, so to speak, because Kronos or Saturn is time and you will die eventually. But during the course of your work span or your work day or your work lifetime or your entire lifetime, you're going to be produced. The people that mirror back to you things that you need to work on are part of your backstage assistance team. Use them as mirrors. Sometimes you're going to be the main star, maybe at work, you're the CEO, and maybe at home, you know, your wife is or something. There's times for being in front, very overt, and sometimes for being back, very covert. A king needs counsel. Leaders need mirrors. We do not do anything alone. You cannot be all the time over, all the time covert. That's the myth of Narcissus. He needed a mirror, and the actual myth said to his mother, hide all mirrors, because if he catches a glimpse of himself, he's going to die, because he was so enamored with himself. That's us thinking we're narcissists, that we don't need anybody. So we actually do need mirrors, and mirrors are obviously linked to other people and judgments and what we don't like other people that's in us. Leadership is not hierarchy. In the spirit realm, that's what I buy into, and I'll share with you my sort of leadership model. We need to be team players and leaders simultaneous. So there are two sort of leadership styles here: the traditional leader, where the leader's at the top, and then the servant leader, where the leader's at the bottom. And I'll leave that for you, and we'll talk more about that this month to decide which you think is best. I found 10 qualities of a great employee and 10 qualities of a great boss. I really like these. Communicates clear vision, connects the vision to daily tasks. This is clarity, sets clear expectations. This is very much 48 to 52, provides feedback and coaching, and perhaps what you did wrong so that you too can maybe grow in a leadership position if it's something what you want. Cares about the employee, shares personal experiences. I'm a team player. I'm human just like you. Team development, values employee perspective. So again, your authenticity in the way that you show up. In the employee attributes, ambitious, autonomous, confident, reliable, eager. These are great traits, but they're not as defined. And it goes back to, we have to have very clearly defined, measurable values or qualities so that somebody can live up to those expectations. If not, it's covert manipulation and we're setting people up to fail. So a few slides left. I told you we'd go over a little bit today. So this is my chocolate chip cookie philosophy of leadership. So this is a chocolate chip cookie. I told you that the universe is basically all of the cookie dough, and you're just sort of a plop. So here is you on your side of the throne, 48 to 52. You are one big cookie. But here are 12 chocolate chip cookies that represent either the disciples or the Olympians or the archetypes, which is what we do in this class. And we have to understand that it is the combination of these 12 morsels or these 12 cookie bites that equal us. Even though we're sort of the center of our solar system, and I'll show you an image in a moment, we have all those aspects within us. And to think that we're judging the lazy guy in the cubicle or the dirty girl down the street, or, you know, the one that talks loud in meetings, that it has nothing to show us, whether we're a leader or simply an employee. That's what I say about sometimes you're up top and sometimes you're in the back. Somewhere in your life, you're a leader. Somewhere in your life, you're the authority. So working as a sacred space and using these archetypes to mirror for you so that you can show up as the leader or the team player elsewhere is crucial. So in Greek philosophy, there's something called the dodecatheism. That is the 12 Olympian gods. We talk a lot about that. There were also 12 titans prior to that, but this is directly related to the 12 Olympians. So we use those a lot with our archetypes: Neptune, Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn. There are 12 disciples in the Bible, and there are 12 archetypes that we refer to. They're all saying the same thing. These are aspects of your mind. They show up, and what we want to do is get them in congruence so that you show up as one divine person, one whole individual, not that fragmented I, and the roles determine who you're going to be and where you're going to show up. And it's your value system, your philosophy of life, and your rule book that is going to determine that. And if you know that all 12 archetypes are in you and everything is a mirror, like in the chocolate chip leadership style, then every single archetype is going to show you what you need to integrate. So here's the Last Supper, Christ with his 12 disciples. Here are the Olympians. Here's Zeus with all the other Olympian gods. Looks kind of familiar, I think. Here is 12 sons of Jacob. Again, they're all clustered. 12 is a theme. I couldn't find a picture of 12 people around a conference table, but assume that these are your 12 fellow employees or bosses or leaders. It's about the personalities or the archetypes or the disciples or the gods, whatever language you like. The chocolate chips doesn't have to have any religious significance. It's simply aspects of your mind. So here are 12 archetypes, and we have all of these, and we show up in different ways. So here's sort of the planetary representation. You're the sun, you're the center of the solar system, and these are all your aspects. So you've got an emotional nature with the moon. You've got a rational intellectual nature with Mercury. And think of the people in your work that meet this. You've got maybe the aggressive or angry archetype, the loving, compassion, or sensual archetype. You've got the Jupiter, which is sort of like the expansion or the abundance, or the loud person that travels and knows it all. You've got Saturn, maybe more of the depressed or the limited or the old person, wise person at work. You've got Uranus, the rebel, the one that creates chaos in the lunchroom. You've got Neptune. We all have Neptune. We talked about today, that codependent, passive aggressive, maybe innocent, flaky type of person. You've got Pluto, maybe someone who's very jealous or possessive or envious in the office. You've got Chiron, maybe someone who's very sick or acts like the wounded warrior. And then you've got maybe the scandalous or the vulgar Black Moon Lilith. All of these archetypes are in your psyche and in your workplace. Here I just have the symbol of wheat because I shared with you the story of Joseph when he saw 11, here are the 11 stalks of wheat, bow to him in the center as the sun. These archetypes are there to help you, to mirror to you, to like bow to you so that you could see where you need to bow, where you need to bend. So in the squared circle, you guys know is my favorite symbol. 3 times 4 is 12. 3 is the number of the thought, emotion, desire, and 4 is the number of the square of the earthly element or the body. The heart chakra, which ultimately is the goal, once we sort of get purified and refined and bend and integrate our 48 to 52, our values, our rule book, our philosophy of life in Virgo, when we reach the 12th sign in Pisces, the healthy high vibration Pisces, then we can love all with heart. There are 12 petals in the heart chakra. It's coming here to the agape love, to give back to society and be a servant. So one of the things that I do, and we'll talk more about this during the month, is I created a leadership wheel that is cyclical. There's no hierarchy in the universe. I understand in the earthly world there is. So in my model of leadership, which is also it sort of reverts to team building, I want to be a leader and a team player at the same time. I did it in a circular fashion, which is what spirituality indicates, spherical and cyclical. So I start here with vision, dedication, adaptability, empathy, authenticity, service, honesty, influence, integrity, respect, resilience, and personal development. as the themes that I, as a leader, as well as a team player, need to provide or participate in. I've defined these in my value system very specifically. What I did was I created for this slide a 0 to 100. And what I invite you to do, and I'll share this with you, with perhaps if you work in IO, where you can have your client maybe define vision and short-sightedness and then find the 48 to 52. So it's sometimes what I do with people. I'm about to wrap up. So in Ayurveda or in the Vedas, there's something called the Gunas, and these are the states of mind. Sattva is sort of like the best one, if you will. We have all three. Rajas is very sort of active and penetrating, and tamas is more of like a lazy or a complacent sort of state of mind. So we're constantly cycled between all three. The point of this is to sort of like categorize it as much as it can possibly be categorized. Tamas is linked to a state of mind that's linked to more covert, manipulative, hidden, 0 to 100 sort of theme. So again, they're the swings of the mind, and it's linked to burnout. Remember, I told you burnout is trying to live from the higher consciousness because you don't want to see the low level consciousness, which is tamas, which is veiling power. So it's sort of the hidden truths that you don't want to see. You don't want to have eye in and remove the veils. Rajas is very penetrating or projecting power. That would be very linked to overt power currency. These are larger illnesses, the ones that are very clearly taking up space. This is linked to stress, the sort of child cycle, continuous fight or flight that is cause of 51% of illnesses just in the past year. And then ideally is the mental state of sattva, which is revealing power. Revealing meaning you reveal exactly what you are in both the covert, the overt, the bad buckets, the good buckets. It's balanced. You know that you are divine, but you also know that you're earthly. You know that you're, in position of power, but you're also a team player. And this is known as sattva. And that's the one we want to achieve through our sort of trial and error of our work life. And just to wrap up, Vedanta is a branch of philosophy and spiritual philosophy called Vedanta, and it actually means the end of knowledge. The Vedas are textbook spiritual books, and the last section of the Vedas is called Vedanta, which is the end of. Knowledge meaning sort of tangible intellect, so to speak. Now we have to sort of dethrone even that. And I told you that as we bend and become more flexible and we go into our vocation, we eventually have to release ourselves of dogma. But what this branch of philosophy states is, I'm not the body, I'm not the senses, I'm not the intellect, I'm not the mind, I am simply consciousness. And this is one thing to really strive for at work. You're part of a team, you're interconnected. And if you can see everybody like those archetypes as someone in the law of correspondence providing some information for you to discern what it's useful for you, then you actually are contributing something to the workplace from a larger standpoint, and the workplace contributes to you. I do have clients check in with their personal values and their company values because it's super important that those are somewhat in alignment and overlap. As I told you last week, the circle overlap, and that there's some shared value system. It may not be all of them, that's fine. It's just like in a relationship, but there has to be a space of shared values. The second is my choice is with reverence to action. I don't want to overburden myself. I don't want to pretend that I have more time, effort, and resources to give to this organization or this company. Again, that's manipulation. That is an attempt to be lazy in another area of your life. So you don't want to overextend sort of the influence that you have, but within the space that you can do something, are you meeting your goals and your accomplishments in that particular area? Third, which I think is probably the most important, I have no choice over the results. Let go of the outcome. If you think that every single thing you're in control of, that is greedy. That is absolute greed. and that you're attached to the outcome that you want at all times. Number 4, I can engage in the world harmoniously. If you sort of release your desire for the result, then you're not Rajasic. The Rajasic person, the Rajas from the previous slide, is someone who's like really outcome based, that over, I want a desire, I want a result, I want some sort of competition, if you will. There's something to win. A Tamas person is indifferent or lazy and they don't show interest. That's linked more to the burnout. I want to hide, so to speak, my Rajasic or overpower struggle and pretend that I'm above, but it's really not. Whereas Sattvic is harmony. You view the workplace as dharmic. You view it as something that you have something to gain and there's a result, but you also let go of the outcome, so it becomes more play and a sacred space. And lastly is I remain anchored in the midst of activity. If you are identified with your role, this will make you sick. This keeps you fragmented. This keeps you separate. This does not mean that you're being a good sort of employee, because then you're taking away from other areas of your life. And here's the link to this particular article, which is a gentleman who wrote about how to use Vedanta principles at work. And it really boils down to consciousness, using work as a sacred space to develop consciousness and grow in your consciousness, your vibration, as you integrate and dethrone your parents and become very clear as to raising your vibration in this lifetime, as well as being the king or queen of your own life. I'm going to stop and take attendance. Any questions?